Biomutant is an imaginative, single-player action RPG set against a post-apocalypse where tiny mammals have become martial arts masters. Think TMNT, but instead of turtles, Splinter found a ferret, a guinea pig, someone's cat, and Gizmo from Gremlins. These weird-looking mutant animals have inherited an Earth in danger of ending all over again, but not before they learnt to walk upright and build guns. However, while it's buoyed by some fantastic enemy creature designs and boasts a deep well of combat options and customizable weapons, these successors are married to some fairly basic and repetitive objectives, quests, and puzzles, as well as a story that seems to regularly overstate its own substance. Thinking that trekking around a vibrant and varied open world filled with strange creatures and primitive civilizations trying to stave off a second Armageddon sounds a little similar to Sony's esteemed Horizon Zero Dawn, you're on the right track. Horizon Zero Dawn with rodents isn't exactly the worst description for Biomutant. Hell, it even features a robot horse. Horizon is far from the only influence on Biomutant though, because it appears to scrape inspiration from a wide assortment of sources, from the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's extreme temperature zones, to the seemingly infinite array of weapon combinations of Borderlands, and from Devil May Cry's cocktail of gun combat and hack and slash to Kung Fu Panda. That last one is probably fairly self-explanatory. To its credit, the way Biomutant fuses all its components together has resulted in something that is actually unique, at least broadly speaking. It's certainly the only open-world, post-apocalyptic kung fu action RPG starring anthropomorphic animals I've ever played. The key disappointment is that the structure of the actual game that all these ingredients have been injected into is anything but unique, with objectives and tasks overtly recycled or riffed upon mission after mission.
Kaboom! You're in!
The first several hours are probably the worst offenders, even though it's engaging at first. The clever character creation system is a bit like a genetic dartboard, automatically adjusting your hero's appearance depending on what core stats you want to bolster before diving in. Additionally, there are a bunch of available character classes that will define your avatar's initial appearance. As a meathead with an aversion to magic, I opted for a commando build for a focus on firepower, and ended up with a character that looked a bit like Sylvester Stallone's cat after an exclusive diet of plutonium-laced Fancy Feast and Rambo movies. But if you want some kind of pink warlock mouse, Biomutant has your back. After it walked me through its linear intro and deposited me into the open world, Biomutant seems to spin its wheels a bit. Choosing a tribe to ally with locks you into certain goals, uniting or conquering the tribes, and either saving the Tree of Life or letting it die. However, either way, the enemy base conquest mission thread quickly unfurls to reveal that it's largely just a series of repeated sequences and recycled vignettes.
Your Sifu thanks you.
There's no real flexibility when it comes to conquering outposts, and invisible walls will stop you if you try to come at it from another angle. You can only tackle them via a rigid series of encounters repeated from tribe to tribe and base to base, whether you're trying to unite the tribes or conquer them.
The outpost belongs to your tribe now.
An even bigger letdown came later as I began to tackle Biomutant's 4 key World Eater bosses. The boss fights are identical whether you're trying to stop them from eating the Tree of Life or whether you're trying to let them eat it. They just come back to life and keep on munching, making the whole encounter pointless. Preparation for each boss tends to follow a consistent formula: gather a bunch of parts for a vehicle, and catch 5 tiny creatures that you'll later be able to launch at these bosses as distractions. A lot of Biomutant is just collecting stuff, and collecting stuff just isn't that interesting after a while. Anyway, why am I catching these rubber ducks when there's a whole box of the bastards right here? Come on, folks. It's a shame the missions and objectives feel stale so quickly because the world itself is very impressive. There's a great sense of grand scale, particularly with things like the enormous Tree of Life and landmarks like collapsing bridges and a decaying dam. It's extremely varied too, from thick forest to scorching desert and fluorescent radioactive zones to barren wastelands. They're filled with enemies with truly fantastic character designs, and there are so many different types of rival creatures and crazy mutant animals to battle, large and small. My first run through Biomutant took just over 20 hours, and yet even by the end of that I was still encountering enemies I'd never seen before, from killer plants to giant furry monsters wearing pajamas. They're not always particularly smart and can be prone to getting hung up on obstacles, trapped on ledges and stuck in rooms. but the range of enemy types is terrific. There's also an impressive range of choices for fighting them. Biomutant supports a vast pile of different combat options, so many that it feels unlikely two friends would ever find themselves taking identical approaches. For most of my playthrough, I went with a strict focus on a mighty two-handed melee weapon, a heavily upgraded automatic rifle, and a couple of powers I'd found useful, including levitation, a ground pound that spews out toxic waste, and a supernatural rapid dash move. I'm sure you'll gravitate towards entirely different perks, considering you have everything from ice powers to mutant mushrooms to choose from. I don't know if I can say that all the powers are different enough to profoundly shift up the moment-to-moment combat, but having the agency to pick perks that, for instance, got me off the ground and out of danger when necessary definitely suited my playstyle. Everything about Biomutant is a bit weird, so it should come as no surprise that its story is very strangely delivered. Beyond what appears to be the good and evil halves of your character's conscience, all of the dialogue is delivered by a single narrator who explains the world and translates NPC dialogue. It's initially kind of quaint, though I found it a bit wearisome over time.
Look at you, all pooped out.
It's not so much the narrator's random interjections, it's more that his regular attempts at profundity write a lot of checks that a game that's really just about hamsters bashing the crap out of each other with toilet brushes struggles to cash. Biomutant seems to have a lot it wants to say about the past, the future, and possibly forgiveness, but its fortune cookie wisdom feels a fraction too earnest.
Everything in nature is dual, and so is evolution, as it struggles to find balance in creation.
The writing itself also swings drastically between overly verbose to gratingly childlike, and eventually I began to find it a bit much. One minute the narrator is waxing philosophical about the ever-branching and beautiful ramifications of the tree of life, and the next he's telling me all about porky puffs and pong paddles and pling-plong booths.
That's something. A ring-dinger from the yesterdays. A thingamabob used to pling signal the faraways.
I suspect a lot of folks will probably have more stamina for this than me, but for mine I think it leans a little too hard into its toddler neologisms, and the result sounds a bit like someone forced Sir David Attenborough to narrate In the Night Garden. You know, the BBC's bafflingly impenetrable Teletubbies on Acid kids show that only makes sense to preschoolers and Teletubbies fans who do acid.
Thanks you for thinking of their tum-tums.
With excellent enemy creature design, a rich and diverse world, and piles of choice when it comes to combat and customization, Biomutant has a lot of the building blocks of a top-drawer action RPG. It's really missing only a few, but they're big ones. Its cookie-cutter approach to objectives and puzzles feels 2 or so generations off the pace of other open-world action games, and that leaves the quest to gather all the things feeling repetitive early on. For more action RPG verdicts, check out part 1 of our review of Mass Effect Legendary Edition and our review for Assassin's Creed Valhalla Wrath of the Druids. For everything else, stick with IGN.
Yes, you can do anything. The sky's the limit. Now, let's take this back to Earth.